Historians tend to assume that in the pre-modern past, water was avoided as a beverage. People believing that its consumption was risky, if not downright dangerous, to human health. And it is true that contaminated water and food were a constant problem, the source of both individual illnesses, often appearing as dysentery in the records, or epidemics of fevers. However, before the emergence of germ theory in the later 19th century, water consumption was not necessarily identified as the cause of these different afflictions. And I think we risk projecting back through the centuries the much deadlier experience that Asiatic cholera had during the second half of the 19th century, and the change in perceptions in the link between water and disease. That was eventually at least one of the results. Instead, in the early modern period, I'd argue, people knew through long experience which waters were best, which were to be avoided, even if the logic behind this knowledge was necessarily expressed in a markedly different medical language than our own. How was this intake, the drinking of water, regulated? Drinking water is perhaps unique in that it's potentially, at least, both element, aliment, and medicament. And yet the medical history of drinking water is yet to be written. And by the way, I like the fact that drinking water, certainly in English at least, it can refer both to the act of consumption and the thing being consumed. In this presentation, I propose to compare knowledge around water consumption with medical practice and how both of these changed during the early modern period. And the early modern period, by the way, for my purposes here, is roughly 1500 to roughly 1750. And we'll begin with a brief discussion of the kinds of water analyses that were done during this time, another history that's yet to be written, but it's something I'm looking at the moment. And this especially before the advent of quantitative chemical analyses that begin really in the later 18th century. I'll then move on to a discussion of medical knowledge proper, both as it relates to medical theory and to medical practice. And for the first, medical theory, I'll consider the printed guides to staying healthy and living a long life, as of instant, the regimen manuals of the time, a very successful literary genre. And for the second, medical praxis, I'll turn to medical case histories and clinical consultations, both of these having real patients as participants, as opposed to the more theoretical regimen manuals. And this to understand how doctors put their knowledge into practice over the course of the period. From the time of the Byzantine physician Paul of Aegina, doctors were reminded to be, and I quote, experts in the good and bad properties of water used in every regimen. In addition, to judge the quality of a particular water, one naturally relied on one's senses, and this also the case from antiquity, to determine whether a particular water appeared clear and had no noticeable taste or smell. These are the criteria for defining a good water, which I should reiterate is not the same as our own definitions of water purity. According to two Roman doctors active in the second half of the 16th century, one could also judge the quality of a given water, and I quote, by the habit and color of the people who normally drink it. If they are lively colored and live long and healthy lives, with a clear voice and a strong head and chest, one can see that their water is good, This according to Giovanni Battista Modio, writing on the River Tiber. Bad waters, on the other hand, made people pale, with fewer surviving to old age, and those who did suffered a variety of afflictions. Inferior waters were those that were greasy to the touch, or had a pronounced odor, a murky appearance, or a notable taste, such as that of Roman cisterns, that, and I quote, taste like earth and shrimp, as they say, suggesting putrefaction. That, according to Alessandro Petronio. And drinking this water, he went on, caused hoarseness and sometimes even toothache. For the early modern period, every water was different. The important distinction between our own tendency to use the word water in the singular, especially true in English, and the pre-modern idea of waters in the plural reflects a much deeper difference in the way water was perceived. The modern scientific abstraction, that is the molecular formula H2O, is radically different from the classical notion of each manifestation of water as unique in its properties, in its characteristics, in its effects on the body. Two ancient Roman sources set the tone for the Renaissance knowledge of water. Book 8 of Vitruvius's 10 Books of Architecture and Pliny the Elder's Natural History. Both authors devoted significant attention to the great variety of waters, particularly those from springs, wells, rivers, and occasionally to the diversity of natural phenomena, such as rain. A third classic work, especially fundamental for Renaissance physicians, is, of course, Hippocrates' Airs, Waters, and Places, which deals with waters in their plurality, emphasizing their different effects on bodies and their influences on the cultures of peoples in different parts of the ancient world. This basic perception of the plurality of waters and the language, the vocabulary that accompanied it, only began to change, and only very slowly, with the work of Antoine Lavoisier, 1783, and the reduction of water, all water, to a chemical compound of oxygen and hydrogen, two terms also coined by Lavoisier himself. As an example, trying to enter into this mindset as well as the vocabulary, let's take the city of Naples, which had as its main water system the so-called Formale Reale. This was a series of immense and interconnected cisterns, all located many meters below the city and fed by an aqueduct. Even so, not all Neapolitans had access to the waters that the Formale Reale supplied, not even the royal palace, which is why in 1650 there was a standing order for a delivery of 2 cartloads of water every day to the palace. And this wasn't just any water, but water coming from the Dominican convent of San Pietro Martire, which had its own well, whose water was recognized as the best in the city, perhaps the most perfect that there is in all of Italy, which never went bad, according to Giovanni Antonio Sumonte, writing in 1601. The goodness of its water was such that, and I quote from another author, Carlo Celano, the goodness of its water was such that when some personage comes from Spain, remembering that Naples was then a part of the Spanish dominions, when some personage comes from Spain and is strict in applying the law, it is said, he hasn't yet drunk the water of San Pietro Martire, meaning perhaps he hasn't become acclimatized yet to the local political reality. One viceroy, Inigo Vélez de Guevara, apparently drank no other water during his tenure in Naples than that from the well of San Pietro, even taking supplies with him when he went on military campaign. This well's water was still being praised as the very best in Naples in the 1780s, when the doctor Nicola Andria undertook the first quantitative chemical analyses of the city's various waters in 1783. Now, the question is, were Neapolitans simply making a virtue of necessity in praising the waters of this well? To explain their attachment, we must, and I'm quoting from Christopher Hamlin here, re-examine our prejudices towards questions of water quality. It's important, as far as possible, as far as we can, to approach this question according to the standards of the time. In a hierarchy of waters, dating back to the time of Aristotle, Hippocrates, and Galen, endlessly repeated in the early modern sources, the best waters were clear, light, and tasteless, coming from springs that flowed eastward, fed by midsummer rains. River water, on the other hand, was to be used only out of necessity and only from large rivers drawn from the cities and free of mud. The worst waters, at least in theory, were well water and pond water. Both required a period of storage to allow their impurities to settle in order to make them drinkable. So how to explain the fame of the water from the well of San Pietro Martire? If the knowledge of the ancients was reiterated throughout the early modern period, it was tested and subjected to new experiences. In this way, certain categories of water considered inferior were rehabilitated, especially in specific contexts. A process of accommodation that applied not only to water in certain wells, as that of San Pietro Martire, but also to underground cisterns, to rainwater cisterns. And speaking of rainwater cisterns, the English physician Tobias Venner, it's a name I'll return to later on, for him, cistern water was amongst the worst for alimentary uses because it was closed off from the air. Whereas for the Venetian humanist Tommaso Ramboni, rainwater cisterns served to purge the water falling from the skies, making it, and I quote, pleasant, without taste or color, indeed sweet and clear and light. And Venice uniquely depended on its thousands of rainwater cisterns for its freshwater supply. This same process of accommodation we can see in the positive attitudes shown by local doctors towards the water of their own river, which invariably ends up favoring its qualities, whether the river be the Tiber, the Seine, the Thames, the Tagus, and so on. To understand the qualities of water, whether these be mineral or plain, and before the advent of chemistry, the use of analytical chemistry in the course of the 18th century, like the analyses carried out by Andrea, whom I've just mentioned, people necessarily relied on their five senses first and foremost. They employed other tests as well in order to determine the wholesomeness or otherwise of a given water. But the senses come first, and we see the use of the senses and the language associated with this kind of qualitative analysis continuing well into the 19th century. And these are procedures that change little from antiquity. Just by way of example, an analysis of water in view of the construction of a new aqueduct in Naples called the Carmignano Aqueduct in the 1620s, gives an idea. The city's deputies commissioned two top university doctors, Latino Tancredi and Mario Zuccaro, to study and analyze the waters of the spring that was going to supply the Carmignano Aqueduct, which would supply or add to the amount of water feeding the city of Naples. And they were to compare the waters of this spring with those of the existing water system, the Formale Reale. The two doctors reported, and I quote, all the diligence and observations, experiences, and tests necessary to ascertain the goodness and quality of the said waters. This involved, quote again, weighing, heating and cooling, distillation, drying on a cloth, and quality in terms of taste, flavor, color, and smell. The doctors reported that the water was very pleasant to the taste, without any hint of extraneous quality, light and clear, indeed somewhat lighter in weight than the water supplying the Formale Reale. Just what the city authorities wanted to hear. Now, having set this context, let's turn to the role of common water in disease prevention and treatment, beginning with prevention and the printed manuals to the guides to the preservation of health. Because whilst the very banality of water means that it's often invisible in written sources, the dietary books provide ample evidence of the importance of drinking water, and indeed the changing practices and attitudes to it during the early modern period. They offer privileged access to the circulation of knowledge about water in the context of the daily regulation of food and drink for the maintenance of individual health. So I'll try to understand present the radically changing nature of this medical advice on water consumption during the period and what it can tell us about the place of water in early modern society. Now, the discourse on water here intertwines element, and medicament, as I suggested before, but these regimens favor the latter two aspects. They favor aliment in particular. So I'll focus on the discussion, what they have to say about everyday drinking water, or what the texts usually refer to as common or plain water, rather than, say, medicinal, mineral, or thermal waters, which are a distinct category in the early modern period, which really requires separate investigation, though I'm happy to discuss this later on. The shift in medical perceptions of drinking water is evident in the changing nature of the health advice. At the beginning of our period, diet was the focus of staying healthy. In the words of the Spanish physician and theologian Álvarez de Mirabal, almost all the maintenance of our health consists in the good order and administration of food and drink. And I'll do this very briefly. This is just a kind of overview of what I have in mind. The entire field of preventive medicine undergoes something of a rebirth during the Renaissance, when Galen was the leading ancient authority and the focus was on individual foodstuffs and their nature. Subsequently, with the rise of Paracelsian and chemical medicine in the 17th century, which I won't dwell on today, there's a shift to predominantly medicinal solutions to health problems. The main focus becomes the cure of disease rather than the maintenance of health. And this shift led to the marginalization of prevention and dietetics. Then, in the early 18th century, mechanical medicine led to a return to preventive approaches. This brought with it a more generalized interest in nutrition as an element in the broader context of health regulation, which in turn led to a revival of regimen books, although it has to be said these books published in the 18th century tended to be much more streamlined in format, with discussions on nutrition per se taking a much less central role as opposed to that of the environment. And as we'll see, drinking water came to play a crucial role in this new mechanized view of the body. But let's begin with the Renaissance dietaries, which all devoted considerable space to water. And they did this either in the airs, waters, places section, if they were following a Hippocratic model, or in a more Galenic-inspired discussion of individual foods and drinks. But right from the start, the ambiguity of water is evident. And to illustrate the role of drinking water in late Renaissance medicine, I'll begin with the treatise by the Bolognese physician Baldassare Pisanelli, first published in 1584. And it deals with the daily regulation of food and drink in the preservation of individual health. For Pisanelli, water is not a food. It doesn't nourish the body because it can't be converted into blood. Rather, in his words, it's a vehicle of food. That is to say, it tempers and thins other foodstuffs, other aliments. The main function of water in the body is to help with the concoctio, model for digestion, the concoctio of elements in the stomach and their assimilation throughout the body. On the other hand, Pisanelli extols the precious nature of water and, I quote, the infinite benefits it brings us. It's a whole paragraph of adjectives on the beauties of water. Water as element, though. Because Pisanelli is all too aware that in a system of galenic balances, the qualities of water as cold and damp, light and non-nutritious present serious problems for the human organism. And this is water as element. Consequently, Pisanelli places a series of restrictions to limit the damage that drinking water could cause. One should never drink water on an empty stomach when there's nothing to concoct. If one's thirsty at night, then moistening one's mouth should suffice. One should not even drink on a full stomach, as it prevents food from touching the substance of the stomach. Nor should one drink water immediately after exercise or hard work, because water, and I quote, harms the head, the brain, the nerves, and alienates the mind. Simply put, avoid drinking water when you're thirsty. Much of this advice is taken directly from ancient authorities dear to Renaissance medicine. But medical authors in Northern Europe were faced with quandary. How to apply this advice, originating from the Mediterranean, to their own northern realities. And this is where local dietary experience, local preferences, confronted the wisdom of the ancients. Another example of accommodation. The English physician Thomas Cogan devotes an entire chapter to the question whether or not it is as wholesome for Englishmen to drink water as for those living in other countries. Cogan speculates that water may be safe to drink amongst people used to drinking it from childhood and in moderate quantities. And he gives the example of Cornwall, which, and I quote, although in a very cold quarter, many of the poorer people who never or very rarely drink anything but simple water are nevertheless strong in body and live well into old age. By contrast, Tobias Venner, a physician in Bath, writing some 30 years after Kogan, disagreed. Water might be beneficial and familiar for those who lived in warm countries, where it was the oldest drink. But for those who lived in cold countries, it is by no means convenient. Thinking of his fellow Englishman, Venner notes how water greatly reduces the appetite, destroys natural warmth, breaks down the strength of the stomach, and consequently confounds concoction. The difference between late Renaissance Galenic medicine and early 18th century mechanical medicine are particularly evident in the work of George Cheney, only 100 years later. Like Venner, Cheney was a Bath physician, although in Cheney's case Scottish by origin and training, but their ideas on water couldn't have been more different. 100 years after Venner had advised the English against drinking water, recommending wine and beer instead, Cheney emphasized that, and I quote, "Water alone is sufficient and efficacious for all purposes of human necessity in drink." Indeed, far from considering wine and beer as superior drinks, Cheney observes that, quote, "It would have been better for the human race had liquor and artificial drinks never been invented." The problem lay in overconsumption. Quote again, "Wine has now become as common as water, and the best never dilute their food with any other liquor. As a result, their blood is inflamed by gout, calculi, and rheumatism, raging fevers, pleurisy, smallpox, measles. Their juices are dried up and their solids burnt and shriveled." Cheney's recommendation, 1 pint of medium light wine a day. So doesn't seem like too much of a sacrifice. Although he does say that for the tender, studious, and contemplative, and I suppose that means most of us, he suggests 3 glasses of water with a spoonful of wine at the main meal. How to explain the shift? The Halle physician Friedrich Hoffmann seems to have been the first author of the early modern period to propose common water as a universal medicine to prevent and cure disease. He did this in one of his many dissertations published in Latin on a wide range of topics. And whilst Hoffmann has been regarded by historians as someone who abandoned Galenic explanations whilst retaining his therapeutic practices, Hoffmann's enthusiastic use of common water suggests an area in which he made a substantial change. The properties of drinking water are seen by Hoffmann in a mechanistic guise. For a follower of iatromechanics like Hoffmann, the concept of flow was essential, both in bodies of water like rivers, as in the human body itself. And this model, the iatromechanical one, which would predominate from the early 18th century onwards, held that water was vital for the maintenance of health. If the body was a hydraulic machine composed of solid and fluid particles, flow was essential to the functioning and good health of the organism. The principles of mechanics underpin both the prevention and treatment of disease, in which water is so fundamental. For Hoffmann, common water was universal. Universal meaning that it was suitable for all human temperaments and all ages. For everyone, it kept the blood fluid. It increased appetite. It purified the intestines. It transported nourishment throughout the body. It ensured clarity of the mind. It even kept teeth cleaner. All which serve to prevent disease. He who drinks water, Hoffman suggested, provided it is pure and excellent, is healthier and longer lived than he who drinks wine. We witness the same change, almost a total shift, if we turn to the role that common water had in medical therapeutics. And to identify changing perceptions of water consumption in treatment, I propose to compare the advice offered by two different doctors, very different chronologically, medically, and geographically. And they're more or less representative, I think, of the two different medical phases that characterize early modern medicine. The first, Epifanio Ferdinando, is typical of late Renaissance neo-Hippocratic Galenic medicine, whilst the second, Francesco Torti, is more typical of early 18th century mechanical medicine. And to do this, I want to focus on the historia or consilia of physicians, sources that have been used relatively little by medical historians, probably because of their sheer bulk, but also because of their limitations as sources. They can be very contrived, they can be turgid, bombastic. They raise problems of self-presentation on the part of the author. At the same time, they provide rare insights into physicians' ways of thinking and practicing. Epifanio Ferdinando undertook his medical studies in Naples before returning to his native Mesagne in Puglia in 1595 to practice as a community doctor, or medico condotto. In his published works, Ferdinando exemplifies the neo-Hippocratic physician typical of the late Renaissance, with his emphasis on location and environment as important factors in disease, and his use of observations based on the narration of individual histories or clinical cases, with a pronounced element of neo-Galenism in his approach to diet and individual foodstuffs. His book, entitled The Gentilcore, published in Venice in 1621, is typical of this genre, with its emphasis on medical practice and empirical observation. The individual medical histories are all taken from Ferdinando's professional practice and are organized quite simply by year, starting in 1596 and ending in 1613. His patients, all local, all from the town of Mesagne, come from all walks of life, as one would expect from a medico condotto, and just over 1/3 are women. Ferdinando is typical of his medical contemporaries, people like Pisanelli, in that he has a marked aversion to drinking water. Far from constituting a part of medical therapeutics, according to Ferdinando, drinking water, especially cold water, actually caused a variety of illnesses. This either as a single cause or in combination with other causes. As can be seen from reading the various historia the author presents, the illnesses thus caused include, it's a long list, paralysis, fever and bladder inflammation, persistent hiccups, night blindness, kidney stones and resulting fever, gout, cachexia, cough, hernia, and palpitations. So drinking water was something best avoided. Ferdinando accepted its use in just one case, a case of diabetes, in which the patient, and I quote, was afflicted with an unquenchable, persistent, and unbearable thirst, and he continually asked for water to drink. But from this exception to total abstention from drinking water was a short step for Ferdinando. In his treatment of a case of dropsy, the patient was not only not allowed to drink water, but not even to see it, and this in line with Avicenna's advice. For Ferdinando and his late Renaissance contemporaries, wine was the drink of choice for the sick, as for the healthy, consistent with the dietary advice in the regimens. Indeed, in one case of heart palpitations, Ferdinando advises the patient to abstain from the water he used to drink and to start drinking little by little more wine. Since wine, and I quote again, in this disease is more medicine than food. Apparently, the patient was only happy to do this. And in a very few cases, and these are usually afflictions of the head, Ferdinando recommends that the patient abstain from wine, but the substitute will invariably be barley water, Galen's favorite delicate drink for its balanced qualities, rather than plain water. In our second series of clinical cases, dating from around 130 years after Ferdinando, the transformation in favor of drinking water is complete, firmly established as both aliment and even more enthusiastically as medicament. Francesco Torti studied medicine at the University of Bologna, graduating in 1678. And together with Bernardino Ramazzini, Torti joined the newly founded University of Modena and eventually became personal physician to the Duke in 1685. Torti is best known for his work on so-called intermittent fever or malaria and the use of cinchona to treat it. Compiled at various times during his medical practice, Torti dictated his 303 medical consultations during his retirement, and this with a view to eventually publishing them, but this never happened. In any case, the consultations mainly date back to the 1720s and 30s and were written in response to requests from local doctors or from the patients themselves. By the 18th century, a medical consultation by letter had become a common and profitable procedure throughout Europe, to the extent that for many physicians, letter writing was an integral part of their professional and scholarly activities. Torti's patients, as evident from these epistolary consultations, were mostly nobles, civil servants, clergymen, and nuns from northern and central Italy, with a sprinkling of foreigners. There's no one from the artisan rank or below. And although Torti is rather although he's rather verbose and florid in the style of the time, the tone of the letters is friendly and also factual. Same time. He presents just enough information to justify his advice and the actions to take without overwhelming the reader with abstract theoretical discussions or grand demonstrations of erudition. If Torti has a method in his medical practice, it lies in the routine use of two therapeutic tools. To quote, "There are two drugs that are universal, if not to eradicate, at least to appease the ferocity of the disease." Torti is writing about a case of epilepsy, but it's an opinion that we could generalize to most of his consultations. The first would be to drink water constantly for the duration of his life. The second is bloodletting, repeated as appropriate many times. Regarding Torti's enthusiastic use of water, what can explain this change? What's new, especially compared to Ferdinando, is the iatromechanical conception of physiology. Torti himself compares the body to a hydraulic pneumatic mechanism, where liquids and solids were both responsible for the functioning of the body, with liquids being the most important. Just as water flowing into channels turns a mill wheel, so the blood flowing through the veins enables the body to function. And Torti uses this water mill analogy in two of his consultations, one of which actually turns into a short essay on diabetes. And here, Torti offers an extensive discussion of the mechanical system, citing some of the leading European iatromechanists of the time. In almost all of his consultations, Torti advises the patient to abstain from drinking wine in favor of water. Water is to be preferred to any artificial beverage. As for wine, I quote, "It is known by experience that just as wine applied externally comforts the nerves, when taken internally, it weakens and induces tremors, dizziness, paralysis, and similar disorders." Torti expresses a marked preference for plain, pure water as the patient's ordinary drink. In other consultations, he refers to clear mountain water, to natural and pure water, or, for a patient in Mantua, to common water from better sources or systems, as long as it is clear. Torti seems here to eliminate any specificity of the different common waters, the differences between different waters. All pure and clear waters seem to be created equal. The advice to drink water, either as food or medicine, is present in almost half of his consultations. So let me conclude. My presentation today has been conceived most generally as a contribution to our growing appreciation of the importance of water for drinking purposes in the culture of the early modern period. Secondly, I wanted to provide an example of the consistency between medical knowledge, here seen in dietetics, and medical practice, seen in therapeutics, taking as a case study drinking water, both as aliment and medicament. We've seen how, as medical philosophies changed from the neo-Hippocratic Hellenic medicine of the late Renaissance to the iatromechanics of the early 18th century, the medical use of drinking water also changed. A close correspondence emerges between the theories and practices of the time, as well as a growing appreciation and enthusiasm for the health benefits of drinking ordinary waters. And thank you very much.